There's a whole lot going on in this set of parables that Jesus uses to describe the kingdom of God, but there's one thing that we need to remember about any discussion about the kingdom of God. The resurrection of Jesus changes everything. Got that? The resurrection of Jesus changes everything. If there's anything to help you understand the kingdom of God, it's remembering that phrase. So this section of Matthew's gospel is called Jesus' third great sermon. The first is the Sermon on the Mount, which we just spent a good deal of time in. The second, Jesus is sending his disciples out to preach the good news around the countryside, and Jesus gives another sermon there. And then this one is all about the kingdom of God and what the kingdom of God is like. This sermon begins before our gospel reading starts with the parable of the seeds. The farmer who sows seed, and some lands on a path, some lands on rocky ground, some lands among thorns, and some lands on good soil and bears fruit. Jesus is, of course, asked what all of this means, and Jesus says, well, you know the explanation of the parable. Rocky soil is the ones who they grow up real fast and there's nothing to sustain them, but the important one's the good soil, who bears fruit 10, 30, 50, 100-fold. The farmer is God and the soil is us. Then Jesus tells another parable of the two sowers. There's the one sower who sows good soil and the sower who sows weeds. The servants are aghast and want to tear up all the weeds, but the first sower says, no, let them all grow. We'll sort them out later. Just let the wheat grow up with the weeds, and then it'll be real obvious which one's which. Then Jesus says the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, which is a small seed that grows into a big enough plant for birds to nest in. And it's like yeast. A little bit of yeast gets in a whole bunch of dough. And in parts of the text that we didn't read, it's like a treasure that someone hid in the field, which someone else found and covered up and then went and bought the whole field in order to make sure he has the treasure. Or it's a merchant who sold everything that he had to buy a very precious pearl. Or it's like a catch of fish when the good and bad fish are sorted and the good kept and the bad thrown away. I'm pretty sure Jesus threw that one in because he had so many fishermen for disciples, and they had these real blank looks on their faces about all the rest of the parables, but then when they got to the fish one, the fishermen all went, oh, yeah, we understand fish. Because, the disciples are like us. We're just not all that smart sometimes. This is a lot of parables all at once about the kingdom of God, and some of it is kind of frightening. I mean, weeds and wheat growing together only to be sorted, and then the weeds burned and the wheat taken into the barn at the end. And then the explanation of the parable isn't much better, where we find out that people will be judged, and some of them get thrown in a furnace and others of them shine in the Father's kingdom. It's real hard to say praise to you, O Christ, at the end of a gospel like that. But remember what I said. Everything changes with Jesus' resurrection. Because the kingdom of God is truly ushered in when Jesus rose from the dead. Yes, the kingdom of God was already there. It was already working in the world. But Jesus, when he rose from the dead, became the first of something new. And all of it ties to that moment. Because what is the seed that is sown? Well, it's the good news that Jesus rose from the dead. It's uncomfortable news sometimes, but when it falls on a receptive heart, the good news spreads into the whole world, producing great amounts of fruit. Or the mustard seed. Jesus is risen seems like such a small bit of news, but when it grows, it becomes huge. It becomes world-changing. Or it's like yeast. When the good news gets into a person, that little bit of good news fills the whole person. Not just a little bit of them, but all of them. Jesus' resurrection is the promise of our own resurrection, and that changes us from the inside out. And yes, there are some warnings of judgment in there, but even they are centered around the resurrection. For those who have spent their lives worshiping God, they are brought into an eternity continuing to worship God. Those who didn't spend this life worshiping God are ushered into an eternity where they don't worship God. One is an eternity with God, the other is an eternity apart from God. But all of it is centered around the resurrection. Because when Jesus rose from the dead, it meant something new. It meant that there was new life that was obvious and present in the world. And the good news of Jesus' resurrection sustained his disciples through situations that we can't even imagine. It sustained the apostles as they were martyred one by one. It sustained Paul as he spent so much of his life in prison. And it sustains Christians all over the world today through whatever hardship they encounter, because the resurrection is the sign that God's kingdom is bigger than any kingdom on earth. That God's kingdom is bigger than any power on this earth. Because Jesus rose from the dead. It's the proof of God's kingdom. It affirmed the words and teachings of Jesus and his divinity in ways that nothing else could have. And so all of these parables talking about the kingdom, the sowing of the good news, the yeast, the treasure in a field, the mustard seed, all of it is because Jesus rose from the dead. And God promises that through faith, we too will rise. And that is news that should take us over. Do we really live our lives trusting the resurrection? Do we really trust that Jesus rose from the dead and we too will rise from the dead because of it? Because that news gets into us and it changes things. We are like that dough that the yeast of the kingdom of God works through, changing us so that we are more and better followers of Jesus every day. Because the resurrection changed everything. And now, as we are strengthened in our hope of our own resurrection, as we are strengthened in the trust of Christ's resurrection, we are also sent into the world to spread the kingdom of God. We are sent into the world to start our own sowing, to spread the good news around as we go about our lives, sharing the joy that we have found in knowing that because Jesus rose from the dead, we too will rise. And that is what the kingdom of God is all about. It's God's power coming into this world in a way that this world doesn't understand. And yet, once it gets into the world, even a small seed can grow. Even a little bit of yeast will grow. Because that's what the kingdom of God does. Because Jesus rose from the dead, he promises that he will raise us from the dead. Let's share that good news. Let's share that joy so that others may have the same hope that we do, that we too will rise like Jesus.